No, we apologize for getting started a little bit late, but let's go ahead and get started. Committee will come to order. I'd like to begin this hearing by stating the Oversight Committee mission statement. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have the right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers do have a right to know what they get from their government. We work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people, to bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Again, I apologize for starting a little bit late. We had votes on the floor, then came over as quick as we could. There will be other members that will join us in the moments that are ahead. A few years ago, a small group of government employees from various agencies gathered for a series of meetings on the social cost of carbon. These agency representatives determined that earlier estimates on the social cost of carbon were incorrect. The previous estimate, done 3 years before, was wrong, apparently by 50%. In 2010, the government believed that the carbon emissions cost the nation $22 per ton. Now the interagency working group believes the cost is $33 per ton. It takes many mathematical calculations to arrive at a social cost of carbon estimate, and we are not here today to make sure that the interagency working group knows how to do its math. Rather, we are here today to determine how they arrived at the updated social cost of carbon, if the process was transparent, and how this updated cost will be used. When the rules and the cost estimates change, typically agencies release data for review and comment. Federal agencies do not and cannot know everything. This review process provides an essential opportunity for them to gain synergistic wisdom of the nation, especially something that will have great effect on the economy. The social cost of carbon will affect the cost of electricity at every home and business, the cost of our cars and trucks, the cost to heat our homes, the cost of food, the cost of every product that is manufactured and transported in America. This is no simple rule change with little effect. This has especially serious consequences for everyone on a fixed income and anyone with limited resources. While I assume some will try to deflect my questions of why and how this cost has changed for every American with rhetoric that Republicans just want dirty air and dirty water, and we want children to have breathing problems and global catastrophes, the facts could not be further from the truth. I want a healthy environment for everyone, but I also think everyone must follow the law. Today is a conversation with the Administration's lead regulator on the rulemaking process and authority possessed by this Administration to change the cost of every product in America. I do not think it is unreasonable to ask how this rule changed, why it changed, what is the science behind the change, who made the rule, and why it came out right now. I hope that today's hearing and any that may follow will bring into light how this Administration sets the social cost of carbon so that the American people and its government can be partners in creating a nation that can power itself effectively, efficiently in the future, and honor our environment. With that, I yield to my ranking member, Mr. Speer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's hearing, and thank you to Mr. Shalansky for being here to respond to questions that we may have. You know, Americans are feeling the impacts of climate disruption, from destructive and deadly storms like Hurricane Sandy, floods, droughts, and some of the largest wildfires in history. It's almost biblical. Cleaning up after climate-driven disasters cost nearly $100 billion last year, one of our largest non-defense discretionary budget items. That works out to be an average of over $1,100 per taxpayer. It is clear we not only have a moral obligation to protect future generations from climate change, we must do it for sound economic reasons. Despite what some may say, there is sound science behind the impact of carbon in climate change. According to the National Academy of Sciences in 2011, climate change is caused largely by human activities and poses significant risks for a broad range of human and natural systems. The preponderance of the evidence points to human activities as the most likely cause for most of the global warming that has occurred over the past 50 years. This year, the nonpartisan experts at GAO added the issue of climate change to their biannual high-risk report. Now, this is truly significant. The GAO is independent, it is nonpartisan, and it placed climate change in its high-risk category for us to review. The high-risk report details the most pressing fiscal challenges facing the Federal Government. GAO found that climate change poses particularly significant financial risks to the nation's economy, warned that our government, quote, is not well positioned to address this fiscal exposure, unquote, and recommended a, quote, government-wide strategic approach with strong leadership and the authority to manage climate change risks, unquote. Laura Tyson of the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and a former chairwoman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton wrote in the New York Times in May, quote, there is much debate about what the proper social cost of carbon might be, but there is no debate that carbon emissions are seriously underpriced. Today's hearing examines part of the Obama administration's effort to listen to the best available science to create a monetary estimate of the cost of CO2 emissions and incorporate that scientific knowledge into a government-wide approach to manage climate change risks, as the GAO recommended we do. Prior to 2008, reductions in CO2 emissions were not valued at all in the Federal cost-benefit analysis. The process of establishing a social cost for carbon was actually begun in the Bush administration, after the Ninth Circuit Court, in the challenge to a regulation, chastised the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in 2007 for assigning a social cost of carbon of $0 in setting fuel economy standards. The Court noted that the NHTSA's failure to account for carbon contrasted starkly with its willingness to quantify equally indeterminate costs and benefits, like traffic noise and energy security. The Court declared the rulemaking arbitrary and capricious. In 2010, an interagency panel consisting of prominent scientists and economists from the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Environmental Protection Agency, among others, developed the first estimate of the social cost of carbon. In May 2013, that figure was updated, and not surprisingly, the cost estimate rose. The interagency working group explained the reason for the increase. That is what the best available science now tells us. In listening to the best available science, the interagency working group was simply complying with the law, which states, quoting from the Executive Order 12866 in 1993, Federal agencies shall assess both the costs and benefits of the intended regulation, and recognizing that some costs and benefits are difficult to quantify, propose or adopt a regulation only upon a reasoned determination that the benefits of the intended regulation justify its costs, and base its decision on the best reasonably obtainable science, technology, economics, and other information concerning the need for and consequences of the intended regulation. There are those who criticize the way the estimate was calculated. Of course, there is room for disagreement with any process, but for those that do, I challenge them to bring their own suggestions on how to improve the process. What I would not agree with are those critics who advocate that we make no estimate. That would be a colossal mistake for any of us in a position of responsibility to make. If we fail to adequately prepare for climate change, billions of dollars in Federal, State, and local investments in public infrastructure will be threatened. I am proud that California has been a leader in reducing CO2 emissions. In fact, while in the State Senate, I voted for AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, which set the 2020 greenhouse gas emission reduction goal. That bill was signed into law by Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. One State cannot do it alone. I have already exhausted my time, so I will complete my testimony and extend my remarks for the record.
That would be just fine. Any other members can also have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. We have one panel and one individual on the panel today, Honorable Howard Shalansky. He is the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, the Office of Management and Budget. Been there a very long time, 8 days now, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah, so glad that you're here. We're gonna get you started in a good conversation here in this way. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses are sworn in before they testify. So if you please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses testified in the affirmative. The way this typically works, and you've been around through confirmation hearings and everything else at this point, but there will be a clock in front of you, your written testimony that you've already given us. Thank you for that. will go into the record. Then your oral testimony will supplement that as well. You have 5 minutes, but we'll have a conversation here in the time to come. You don't have to worry that much about the clock at this point. If you have additional comments, we'll allow you to be able to do that. So thank you. You can begin now.
Thank you very much. Chairman Langford, Ranking Member Speer, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I was recently confirmed as the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, known as OIRA, at the Office of Management and Budget, and I am honored to be serving in this role. I look forward to speaking with you today about the social cost of carbon. When I refer to the social cost of carbon, often called SCC, I mean the values used to calculate the monetary costs and benefits of incremental changes in the volume of carbon emissions in a given year. The social cost of carbon includes, for example, changes in net agricultural productivity and human health, property damage from increased flood risk, energy system costs, and the value of ecosystem services lost because of climate change. Executive Orders 12866 and 13563 direct agencies to use the best available scientific, technical, economic, and other information to quantify the costs and benefits of rules. Rigorous evaluation of costs and benefits has been a core tenet of the rulemaking process for decades through Republican and Democratic administrations. This fundamental principle of using the best available information underpins the administration's efforts to develop and update its estimates of the social cost of carbon. In 2009, the administration launched a process to determine how best to quantify the net benefits from reducing carbon dioxide emissions. The purpose of this process was to ensure that agencies were using the best available information and to provide consistency in economic analysis associated with the rulemaking process across agencies. During the previous administration and at the beginning of this administration, agencies used a range of social cost of carbon values when evaluating the costs and benefits of rules. To determine how best to quantify the net benefits from reducing carbon dioxide emissions, the administration first conducted a preliminary assessment of existing literature in order to set interim social cost of carbon values while it worked on a more comprehensive analysis. Informed by public comments received on rules in which agencies use the interim values, the administration developed and released improved SCC estimates in February of 2010, in conjunction with the Department of Energy Appliance Efficiency Standard rule for small electric motors. Since the release of the SCC values in February 2010, numerous rulemakings have used those values for the social cost of carbon. Agencies using the SCC values in rulemakings received extensive public comments, many of which focused on the discount rates chosen and the 3 peer-reviewed academic models used to develop the SCC estimates. As explained in the February 2010 technical support document, the SCC methodology rests on 3 integrated climate change assessment models, the Fund, DICE, and PAGE models. These models combine climate processes, economic growth, and interactions between the climate and the global economy into a single modeling framework. These are by far the most widely cited models that link physical impacts to economic damages for the purposes of estimating the SCC. The SCC estimates rely on a common set of inputs to each model and equally weigh the outputs of the 3 models, as described in detail in the 2010 technical document. Recognizing that the underlying climate change impact models would evolve and improve over time as scientific and economic understanding increased, the 2010 SCC documentation committed to regular updates and set a goal of updating the SCC estimates within 2 years or after updated versions of the underlying models became available. Since the February 2010 estimates were released, the 3 models that underpin the interagency social cost of carbon estimates have been all significantly updated and subsequently used in peer-reviewed studies. Many public comments urged the agencies to update the estimates based on the latest models. It is important to note that the only changes made in May 2013 to the SCC estimates reflect the refinements made to the underlying models by the people who develop and maintain those models. In other words, all of the changes to the social cost of carbon value were the result of updates to the Fund, DICE, and PAGE models that were made by the model developers themselves. The Federal Government inputs, such as the discount rate, climate sensitivity distribution, and socioeconomic trajectories like population growth used to develop the 2010 estimates, remain unchanged. As explained in the 2013 technical support document, the updates to Fund, DICE, and PAGE reflect, among other things, improvements in the way economic damages from climate change are modeled. The net result of these updates to the 3 peer-reviewed models was to increase the SCC estimates. These net changes reflect many specific changes within the 3 models, some of which increase the estimates and some of which decrease them. Entities outside the Federal Government are using estimates that are similar to the updated SCC values. For example, these updated estimates are consistent with the values used by other governments, such as the United Kingdom and Germany. Major corporations, such as ExxonMobil and Shell, have also used similar estimates to evaluate capital investments. The Administration will continue to investigate ways to improve the social cost of carbon estimates. The current estimates will be used in the economic analysis of rulemakings, and we fully expect comments on the SCC values in the context of future rules. We will consider those comments to ensure that we use the best available information to evaluate the costs and benefits of our regulation. Thank you for your time. I would be happy to answer any questions.
We're not going to run the clock. We're going to have conversations. Is that all right with you? Let me just talk through a couple of things. Again, as I mentioned to you before we were talking, before the hearing began, several of these things, obviously, with your 8 days of long experience there in this position, you're not going to know. Cass Sunstein was in front of this committee as well before, so any problems that you have, blame completely on Cass as the previous OIRA director. But I want to talk through a couple of process issues to say how do we determine this and where do we go from here. Who was the chair of the Interagency Working Group?
The Interagency Working Group was convened by the Office of Management and Budget and the Council of Economic Advisors, with the participation of a couple of executive branch agencies and a number of executive Office of the President policy councils.
Right. I have a list there. The Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, Department of Treasury, White House Council of Economic Advisors, White House Council of Environmental Quality, White House National Economic Council, White House Office of Energy and Climate Change, White House Office of Management and Budget, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Does that sound familiar?
That was the list for 2010. One of the offices was no longer in being by 2013, so the list is almost exactly the same for 2013.
Okay, so which one do I need to take off there?
Office of Energy and Climate Change ceased to be a freestanding office and was folded into the Domestic Policy Council by the time of the 2013 update.
So were they present in this meeting, or they were just represented by the Council of Environmental Quality?
I would have to go back and check whether they had their own representative.
Are there meetings from the minutes or the details about the nature of their conversation? Did they take a vote on this process? Any of that we can get a chance to gather?
My understanding was that this was a consultative, sort of integrated process of ongoing discussions that the various offices had. What documentation there might be of those discussions or meetings is something I would have to go back to check.
Okay. Yeah, we'd like to get some documentation just to see the path. The reason being is obviously this shows up in a microwave oven rule and appears. It doesn't appear that it had additional comment this time. As you mentioned before, this is an update from the 2010, but it's a 50% increase, if I'm counting that right, just on the 3% discount rate. If you're in the other rates, it's much, much higher. So it's a fairly significant increase from the 2010, which raises some red flags. The first of which to say if the model is a trustworthy model and in 3 years it's proved to be wrong by 50%, I'm not sure we would allow that with CBO to continue to keep score if we find out 3 years later their estimates were off by 50%. Does that make sense?
Well, let me address that, because I certainly share your concern that one needs to make sure that one is dealing with models that are reliable. These models, at the time that they were identified and used in 2010, it was well understood that these were the best models available, well peer-reviewed, but that they were also models under development and that they would change. And so these models are maintained by teams of scientists and economists independently of the government. And the choice in 2010 was really whether not to have a social cost of carbon estimate, not to have the best available science and economics factor into the calculation of some values to attach to CO2 emissions, or to deal with what was best available with the knowledge that as those integrated assessment models were fairly new, were beginning to be developed, that they would change and improve.
How were the models selected in 2010? Because you're talking about best available chosen by who, I guess?
Well, the interagency working group looked to see what models were available. And it's important to recognize that what these integrated assessment models do is something that's extremely difficult. There are models that talk about the effects of emissions on climate change.
Sure.
And there are models that talk about economic damages under certain assumptions. These integrated models brought together the climate effects and economic effects to turn them into a damages number. And so at the time that the interagency working group convened, virtually all of the literature that was trying to come up with social cost of carbon estimates, or that was trying to come up with integrated measures of what what damages might be from CO2 emissions, were using these three models. They were the most used and most peer-reviewed.
Was there a conversation about additional models that may be needed for the 2013? That obviously there was this huge shift between 2010 and 2013. Was there a conversation among the interagency working group to say, maybe this is not as reliable as we had hoped, let's go find some other models that are out there?
I do know that the interagency working group is always assessing the availability of other models and whether or not there are other models that are truly integrated assessment models that have reached the level of scientific verification and quality through the peer review process that the Page, Dyson Fund models have reached. What specific models may have been discussed or when is not something I'm aware of at this point.
Obviously you're new in that. So what I'd like to do is be able to follow up and try to get some of the notes of what are the models that they looked at. Obviously, who was there in the decision-making process that they made, any notes that they had during that process of making those decisions, because those will be important for us to see. The cost just shifted for quite a few things in America based on a new microwave oven rule. Now, if we can step back and say with certainty, this is really reliable, this is what the cost should be, that's different. But I think this is an opportunity for Americans to be able to look in as well and say, before my electricity rates go up, before the cost of every vehicle goes up, before my cost of heating oil goes up, before the cost of all transportation for all my food goes up, I'd like to know where this came from and why this actually existed. So for us, it would be very helpful to be able to bring to light who was in part of that process, what was their conversation. That builds trust when you see how did they debate this, what were the decisions that were made, what were the options they looked at, and allow us and outside groups to be able to look at it and say, yes, I completely agree, or no, I don't agree. The difficulty is there didn't seem to be an opportunity to speak into this before it appeared. Do you know if a waiver was requested to not put this in the Federal Register on this particular rule ahead of time?
Well, thank you, Chairman Langford. That's a very important set of questions. Let me start by saying that the social cost of carbon is not a rule. It's not a rulemaking.
Right, I understand, but it will affect everything that I purchase in the days ahead.
Well, it may or may not. The social cost of carbon will be an input into rulemaking processes.
Correct.
And those rulemaking processes, any rulemaking in which the social cost of carbon is used as part of the cost-benefit analysis, will be subject to notice and comment, in many cases to review by OIRA, to ensure that that process has been properly undertaken. And there will be an open opportunity for people to comment on all aspects of that rule, including the social cost of carbon.
But the foundational part of it, once it's settled, this is the foundation. Now we're arguing about, did it reach the $100 million threshold to make this a major rule? Is it significant? Is the benefit outweighed by the cost? Whether you're saying that to a power generation company, or you're dealing with CAFE standards in the future for a vehicle, or you're dealing with transporting fuel for food, all of those things, this is the foundational piece.
Well, it is an ingredient. I mean, we should be clear that this is one piece of the cost-benefit analysis. There will be lots of other things that are considered in the costs and benefits of any emissions or energy efficiency standard that would use the social cost of carbon estimate. So SCC will be an input. There are other inputs that could be extraordinarily important in the cost and benefit analysis. But this is an important input into those models, which is why it is extremely important that the public be able to comment on every one of those rules.
Right. Let me get a chance to honor my ranking member, Mrs. Spear, for some time for questions as well.
Thank you.
Let's go to the integrated model, which sounds really good. It sounds like what you did was include not just the costs, the social costs, but the economic costs. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the economic damage was based on how much more a product would cost, or the economic damage was what would happen if there was a Sandy storm?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman Spear, because I think this gets at the heart of what social cost of carbon is trying to get at. If there is going to be harm to our environment and to our economy from carbon emissions, many costs will go up. The costs of food, the costs of health care, investment that is needed to protect against sea level rise. There are all manner of costs, energy costs, the need for increased energy usage for cooling. All manner of costs may go up for society. That is why it is extremely important to have some kind of measure of what the social costs, by which I mean the costs to society, are of a ton of CO2 emissions. And so prior to the creation or the development of a social cost of carbon estimate, this was sort of an imponderable. In some cases, you referred to the Ninth Circuit case where a value of 0 was deemed arbitrary and capricious. A value would just be assumed away. In other cases, people called for extremely high values to be used. Part of a disciplined rulemaking process is using the best information that is out there, the best minds, the best analysis, the best science that is out there, to come up with a rigorous cost-benefit analysis. That is a limiting principle on, for example, ascribing endless benefits to carbon reduction. But it also stops us from making a big mistake of saying there are no costs to carbon reduction and creating real harm to our economy going forward from environmental damage. So the purpose of the social cost of carbon estimate is to get a measure of what that harm to our society will be, what it will cost us going forward to keep emitting CO2 into the atmosphere.
So I'm still not clear as to whether or not in that model you fold in the additional costs to consumers in terms of the products they buy, or to the businesses in terms of the kinds of steps they have to take to reduce their emissions.
No, so what is in the model is those are all things that would factor very directly into the cost-benefit analysis of any regulation using the SCC number. So you would look separately after looking at the SCC, that is to say the benefits of not emitting the CO2. We would require the agency, or we would expect the agency, to give information about the costs to business.
Okay, so it's not included in the SCC?
Not everything.
All right. So let me ask you this. You indicated that Exxon and Shell and countries like the UK have come up with an SCC. What have they tabbed it at?
The estimates vary. It is hard to, we know from things that have been stated publicly that Shell uses about $40 a ton for its internal estimates as the social cost of carbon. Governments like the UK and Germany use numbers very, very close to the 2013 range of social cost of carbon that the interagency working group came up with.
Like around $38, is that what you're saying?
There are a range of values depending on time period and discount rate, but quite commensurate values. I could get back to you on what their exact numbers are.
So the Chairman indicated this, the issue about tagging this on top of a microwave regulation. And I must tell you, I agree with that. We're all about transparency, so why wouldn't this have been subject, even though it's not a rule, subject to input from the general public and maybe people that are of the belief that carbon has no cost to it, just so that it would be fully digested and evaluated?
So let me answer both the general question about the process by which the interagency group worked, and then talk about the microwave oven rule, in which this new value was, first came to light, if you will, in a regulatory process. The models that underlie the social cost of carbon estimate are not maintained or owned or created by the Federal Government. In fact, they're created by independent scientists and economists. And what's very important about these models, because I think otherwise it would be very hard to use them, is that they are publicly available. The source code and the workings of these models are available on the Internet. Anybody can go and see how the models work. The second thing is that these models are constantly being subject to peer review through the normal scientific process. Journals publish articles that have results and inputs resulting from these models. Those articles are rigorously reviewed and then published and subject to debate and attack. And so these are very well-tested models that have been quite publicly aired and that are publicly available. Now, as for what the Federal Government selected as some of the inputs that would go into the models, things like discount rate, population growth, and other socioeconomic variables, and those values, first of all, are discussed in great detail in documents made public. The 2010 technical support document and then the 2013 technical support document. Just noting, by the way, that nothing changed in those inputs, those Federal Government selected inputs from 2010 to 2013. And those inputs certainly are something that anybody can see, can comment on, can challenge when those inputs and the social cost of carbon are used in a rulemaking. And I would add that the discount rates really are quite consistent with the discount rates that have been aired for quite a number of years through OMB guidance documents like Circular A4, which go to the agencies and counsel them on discount rates and other inputs into their cost-benefit analysis.
Is it true that this model changed in part from 2010 to 2013 because of sea level rise?
It is. If one goes back to the 2013 technical support document, which explains to some degree what the changes were in the models, and certainly if one goes to the model documentation that's freely available from the developers of those models and online, one of the big changes was a more detailed accounting for and a correction for the effects of sea level rise.
And was there some dollar amount attributed to sea level rise as part of this social cost?
I cannot answer exactly what the translation was from the modelers' inputs about sea level rise to a dollar value. That's something I would have to go back and ask about. But it certainly is the case that the sea level rise variable did lead to a higher dollar amount, just as other adjustments to the model, I might add. For example, certain adjustments related to short-term agricultural productivity and certain adjustments related to space heating requirements actually had a negative sign in the sense that they actually pushed down on the social cost of carbon estimates. So the inputs worked in different directions, but led to, on the whole, a sizable increase in the estimate of the social cost of carbon.
I yield back.
Okay, how bold are you that you're willing to put both?
I can do it if you can do it.
We're going to be bold enough, since there's three of us talking, that we're just going to leave all mics on and let's just have a conversation. So we'll freely interrupt each other and pretend that we're actually going to have a conversation. Is that good with you?
That's fine with me, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
Lots more questions in that way.
Yeah, we'll do, and we'll be able to interact more on it. Ranking Member Spears' question about sea level rise and the revision on that, was that based on the models actually seeing actual rise in sea level, or their change in their estimate of sea level rise?
I would have to go back and see which of those it was. It certainly had to do with the scientific literature. And
right, I understand. I'm just trying to figure out, when you talk about sea level rise change and revising a number, I just want to know, have they actually seen a rise in the sea level in the last 3 years? And so we've got to update that, or is this a revised estimate of some future time period and when they expect to see a sea level rise and what that amount might be? I come back to, in college, one of my field experiences in a geology group was to actually go out and do a dig. And I'm in central Texas, just outside of Austin, and we went down about 3 feet, and I pulled up shark teeth. Now, I don't know when the last time sharks were in Austin, but it's probably not been recently. And I don't think it was in the industrial age. And so movement of sea is obviously something that has historically happened. Now, I understand there's great debate on whether that's accelerated based on carbon usage or not. But we have had on North America a significant amount more water on top of us than what we have right now. And so what I'm trying to figure on that is, are they tracking some significant gain in sea rise that's occurring, or are there models out there estimating it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand the question, Chairman Langford. I'm not prepared to testify on the underlying climate science.
Okay. The statement you made about Shell as well, where you talked about the social, is that, does Shell actually have a social cost of carbon estimate that you said is $40 a ton, is that right?
I believe it's $40 a ton, yes.
Okay. Is that their estimate of social cost of carbon? Is that estimate based on regulations? What are they estimating?
Yeah,
there?
I mean, that is an estimate that they use internally when they are setting, from what I understand, when they are setting their investment strategy going forward.
But that's what I'm trying to figure out. Are they assuming this is the detriment to the environment of $40? Are they assuming if we put out a ton of carbon, we're going to have $40 in regulations come down on us? That's what I'm trying to figure out the difference there.
What I think it is, and I want to be clear, I can't testify with certainty as to this, so I'm giving you my best understanding as I sit here today, but I could go back and check further.
Okay.
Is that this is the number they use because they believe it is the number that will factor into regulation going forward.
Okay, so that's a regulation number more than it is an assumption that the company makes. If we put out a ton of carbon, it'll have $40 worth of damage.
But to be clear, it is not an estimate of what they think their costs per ton will be for complying with regulation. It's what they believe the number will be that guides regulatory policy going forward. But again, I really shouldn't say more on that because I need to check.
And you brought the discount rate issue as well.
Yes.
And said it was fairly consistent. I'm not a professional on all the discount rates, but as I pulled through several, it looks like it has a 3% and a 7% number. The 3% number seems to be the one that was landed. And when I looked through this, I didn't see the 7%. As a factor that laid on it. Is there a reason why on that?
Yes. So what discount rates are basically, particularly when we're talking about long-term effects like climate change, they're measures of how much we value the future, how much we value future consumption, future investment, indeed the quality of life and the prosperity of our children and grandchildren. That's what we use a discount rate for. A high discount rate of 7, and I'll come back to what that is usually used for. Just to be clear about what that would mean, it would mean that we are valuing the prosperity, that is to say the consumption and well-being of Americans just 60 years into the future at 0. That we'd basically be saying we should not factor into our policy today any well-being of Americans just, at the time that my grandchildren hopefully will be growing up. So what a high discount rate does is effectively devalues future consumption, future prosperity.
But in the microwave oven rule that's released, it has a 3 and a 7%.
Right. So
just in that rule, but it doesn't for the social cost of carbon statement on it.
Right. So these are two very different things.
Which is part of our confusion why they're released together, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'll come back to that in a moment. The social cost of carbon, we're trying to get a measure of what the cost to society will be over time of a ton of carbon emissions. And we could ask ourselves, well, what would the effect be on the rate of return to private investment? Okay, and typically 7% is used as a discount rate because it roughly approximates the rate of return to business investment, real estate, small business, corporate investment. We don't use 7% when what we're interested in understanding are effects on future consumption by individuals, by consumers, by citizens. What we're trying to get at with the social cost of carbon is what carbon emissions will mean for the expenditures and the quality of life and the standard of living of every American going forward. So consistent with OMB guidance, we would want to use the 3% number, which OMB says is what is appropriate for consumption effects rather than investment effects. Now that said, just two things. To be sure, 7% was not used in the range of numbers given for social cost of carbon because of the belief that it was inappropriate to discount to 0 intergenerational effects that would occur 1 or 2 generations in the future. And indeed, that is consistent with the OMB guidance document A4, which states very clearly that when intergenerational effects are at issue, lower discount rates, perhaps even lower than 3%, should be used. And in fact, there is an emerging body of thought amongst leading economists that for climate change, the 3% number is too high and should be declining over time. There's a forthcoming article in Science magazine by a number of the leading economists of the past half century that make this argument. What the working group did in 2010 and again in 2013 was to provide a range, 2.5, 3%, and 5%. Now, that 5% number is quite a high number if you look at what it implies for future generations. And it also happens to be a blend of considering the consumption effects at 3%, or can be thought of, and the investment effects at 7%. So while it is clearly the case that a separate 7% number was not listed, and we generally do, where appropriate, ask regulatory agencies to include that in rulemakings, for the purpose of this estimate, which was not a rulemaking, it was an input to rulemakings, the judgment was reached that 7% was not appropriate.
But the challenge of it is, as far as the input to rulemakings, it lays out, and I know you've said every time it's used, there'll be opportunity for reply there. But the challenge is that now every time it's used, it has to be fought rather than discussing it the first time. Americans did not have large-scale input on the first time it's used to say, is this appropriate? Does this line up? Can we see the science? Can we talk about it? Instead of dealing with it the first time and coming to an agreement and revising it as is normal, well, there'll be review and comment, there'll be letters. I know you mentioned before that there were letters that encouraged you to update this. Now that the models have changed, people were writing you or contacting you and saying this needs to be updated, and I'd be interested to see those letters if they were on both sides and what the mechanism were for receiving those letters, or if they were just informally people were writing and saying, hey, the models changed, you ought to change this, or was there an open statement to say, hey, the models have changed, should we update this and allow review and comment? But the same on this. That's typical. If we put out a new rule, if we put out a change, if we put out something that's significant, people have input on it the first time rather than saying, here it is, every time it's used, you're going to have to fight it now from here on out.
And I guess to add to that question, to what extent is the social cost of carbon incorporated in various bids that are put forth or requests for proposals? I'm presuming this is all within the Federal Government, right? This would be something we would ask, we would have people fold into their bids relative to various projects that they would be competing for?
I don't know the extent to which the social cost of carbon would factor into our procurement policies or other kinds of bid situations. The main purpose for the interagency working group was so that agencies passing emissions and energy efficiency standards would have some kind of value that they could use in calculating the benefit side of the cost-benefit analysis. So if we're going to impose a regulation on business, if we are going to ask business to undertake certain kinds of costs or ask the American economy to adjust to a different world in which there are lower carbon emissions, what are we getting in return? And so the purpose of the SCC number was really as an input into the regulatory process. And Chairman Langford, to come back to the transparency point, I agree with you completely.
Yeah, it seems odd. It seems like you wouldn't put this in a microwave oven rule, which is a relatively small SCC. You would put it into a rule dealing with power plant generation or something that's really large and significant to say, okay, this is, we're going to putting a stake in this is very significant. We need to debate this rule, and let's put it out for comment.
Well, you know, the SCC would be used in any rule that
right,
would
I understand,
affect carbon
but you got to admit, in a microwave oven rule, I think we're fairly small SCC footprint on that one.
Well, you know, nonetheless, it's very interesting. If you look at that final rule, and I might add, by the way, that the updated social cost of carbon value from 2013 did not drive the standard in that rule. That standard was justified under the 2010 numbers as well.
Right, I understand, but it's released in that.
It is released.
Right.
And what the agency did in an effort to be transparent, to say, hey, we, as counseled by OMB, as required under the executive orders, are using the best technical, scientific, and economic information that's available. Here's some information that's available. We're going to run our calculations using not just the 2010 numbers, but the 2013 numbers as well. Therefore, making it clear, here these numbers are now out there, and these are going to be used in rulemakings. And I actually think that when you think about the opportunity to comment on every rule that might use a social cost of carbon estimate, whether it's an energy efficiency rule or an emissions rule, that leads to more ongoing input. I liked your reference in your talk about the synergistic input that comes from people all over this country. That can happen in every rulemaking procedure.
Right. It definitely creates more input, but it creates more input with and more activity because you're chasing down 100 issues now rather than dealing with the first one. It's the difference between if I've got a problem with hornets in my backyard, trying to kill each hornet one at a time, or actually going to the hornet's nest.
Well,
if you're settling the issue of what is the social cost of carbon, and it is typical for us as a nation to say our government is servants of the people, and there's interaction, and that synergistic wisdom that we gain from the outside, that there's a sense that we want to have input from everyone at the very beginning, and if you're going to be affected by this rule, you should have an opportunity to be able to comment on it at least and to be a part of this. And I know you keep saying it's not a rule, but it's going to be used all over the place, and it will be consistently applied across a wide variety because, as you mentioned before, the SEC now is not different in each agency. It will be unified across all agencies, and there will be a multitude of these battles that repeats over and over again rather than dealing with it the first time the right way.
So one thing that would have happened, that could happen if you have one big proceeding just to focus on the social cost of carbon, is that proceeding happens and that becomes locked in. It then becomes something, you had your opportunity to comment, now we're going to use it until we decide to update it again. What's great about the fact that this is an input into rulemaking that people can comment on in any rulemaking in which they have an interest is that as new knowledge comes into being, as new science is published, as new models come in, somebody can come and say, you're using that social cost of carbon value from the 2013 technical support update. That is out of date. We've got information that there's a better value you should use. And you don't have to participate in every rulemaking in order to do that. In any rulemaking, if in just one rulemaking, significant information comes to the attention of the regulatory agency and to the government, that will feed into the ongoing process that was promised in 2010 of revising the social cost of carbon.
So how about in 2010? How was this how was this kind of previewed? Was it attached to yet another rule?
Well, it was. So there's a little bit of history to what happened. After concern arose about the disparate range or the range of values that was being used by different government agencies for the social cost of carbon, the administration sat down and said, okay, we need a process for coming up with a more rigorously determined and consistent number. Okay,
let's back up then. You just said there was a different range of SCC used throughout the government. So did SCC start during George W. Bush's administration, or was that when it was first identified because of the court case? How did we first come to use SCC in rulemaking?
Well, I think the concept's been around for a while. I think that my understanding is that the first use by Federal agencies in rulemaking of SCC was in, I believe, 2008. So it was during the Bush administration. And was
that due to a court case or due to an administration decision, or where did that originate? I guess part of our question.
I do know that there was the 2007 court case. I have no knowledge of whether the reasons that agencies, for example, other than the NHTSA use social cost of carbon was because of that court case or because of a policy decision. I don't.
Or does it date back to the Clinton administration when cost-benefit analysis was deemed appropriate with any new regulation?
Well, so social cost of carbon, I don't think you could tie back to that. It was something that was developed in order to make sure that as regulation aimed at emissions, climate change through emissions control and energy efficiency standards, that the requirement of rigorous cost-benefit analysis where possible would be met. So it certainly was developed. Some of the motivation for developing the number comes out of that mandate for cost-benefit analysis where possible and where legally permissible. A social cost of carbon number specifically, I have no knowledge of whether that was contemplated or considered during the Clinton administration.
So in 2008, the first value of an SCC was what?
There were different values used by different agencies.
Oh, so that's where it was.
I would have to check to get back to you, but there was no single number. So when the Obama administration decided to convene a process to come up with a social cost of carbon number, They first developed interim values that were culled from existing peer-reviewed academic and scientific literature and came up with interim values that were put out for comment. And while those were put out for comment, and by the way, agencies used those values and said, look, we're going to use these values, and they were part of the comment in the rulemaking procedure. The Obama administration interagency working group, the administration group, continued to work on coming up with the 2010 number. When they did come up with the 2010 number, they released it as part, I believe, of a rule related to the efficiency of small electric motors.
Right.
And received comment on the 2010 number as part of that rulemaking. And then subsequently, and I'd have to double check the exact number, I believe that 18 to 23 rules since that time have used the social cost of carbon. Maybe it's 18 final and 5 proposed rules. I'd need to go back and check the exact numbers. Have used the social cost of carbon number and have received comments on the social cost of carbon analysis.
So in terms of, you said 18?
It's 18 to 23. I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And of how many, what's the universe we're talking about? Thousands of rules? You're saying it's been used in 18 to 23?
Rulemakings. Those were those were individual rules. Those were regulations.
But there's thousands of rules that are made every day in this country, right, by agency?
Right.
So this is a very small, I guess what I'm trying to understand is how large an impact has it had to date. It sounds like it's impacted 18 to 23 rules. Now, some of those rules may be very widespread in their impact.
Can you give some examples of some of those rules?
I don't have the list.
Maybe you can make a list available to us.
The list is very easy to obtain. I'll go back and ask if it's possible to turn that over. But but what I would say is, yes, the number of rules may be small in the universe of federal rulemaking. There is no doubt that the social cost of carbon will be used in some very economically significant rules.
Right, and that's the concern, is that you start dealing with power generation, transportation, manufacturing. I mean, it gets up in a hurry as far as increasing or decreasing costs, when regulation can come down and say, no, this is not economically significant because of the social cost of carbon. We decrease this, so now it's under $100 million in economic impact. We suddenly get into a whole different debate about this. Or to say, I'm aware that this will cost your company $1 billion, but we think it will have $1.1 billion in gain in the social cost of carbon. Now it gets really significant.
So let me address a couple of things. The social cost of carbon number, if used in a benefit calculation to offset a cost calculation, would not be able to be used to evade review of the rule. So let me make that clear. The designation of an economically significant rule focuses on the costs to the U.S. economy, and that rule would still be reviewed.
Minus benefits.
No, when we're
just cost period.
When it comes to whether a rule is economically significant, we look at whether it will cost the U.S. economy $100 million a year or more. So that's not a net benefit calculation. It's definitely, I want to be very clear about that, the social cost of carbon number is not at all to be used to evade review by my office, by OIRA. The cost-benefit analysis in the federal review process can't be evaded through use of some number that erodes costs. If the costs are there and it's economically significant, it's going to get reviewed. What the social cost of carbon number does do, as you correctly pointed out, is allow those costs to be put in the context of expected economic benefits to society by monetizing the cost to society of putting an additional ton of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. And one of the reasons it is so critical that this number be updated and that it be correct, insofar as science and economics will allow, is because we don't want people declaring, well, there's an unlimited benefit to reducing CO2 emissions, and then imposing any cost whatsoever on society today because of the regulation. There has to be a meaningful analysis of what those benefits are. So the social cost of carbon number, while some may think it's much too low and others may think it's much too high, does act as a limiting principle on the benefits calculation. The other thing I might add, just to go back to the ability of people to come back and critique the number and to provide input on whether or not a revision is necessary, it is important to recognize that this number is not by any stretch of the imagination generated by a black box. The number that is in the 2010 document and the number that is in the 2013 technical support document comes from models that are available. Anybody can, who has the expertise, and the expertise is fairly widespread, can use these models, can use different assumptions, can see what those models would generate, and could come back and say, we wish to challenge these assumptions that underlie the benefits calculation in this particular regulation, and show you why you think you got it wrong. That will prompt a serious analysis of that regulation.
So one of the points you make is that since it's not part of a rule and not part of rulemaking, it can change. But that can be also a thorn in businesses' side if all of a sudden this month it's $38 and next year it's $58. So there's no certitude to it. Is this somewhat of a fixed number for a period of time, or can this be changed because the model is available and people can make some assumptions and come up with a better determination?
So let me give you two answers to that. One is what is happening out there outside of the government, in the world of the scientists and the economists who work on this, and the other is what happens inside the government. The models are always, to my understanding, being adjusted, reviewed, and worked on by the model developers. Now, that doesn't mean that every month they're releasing a new version of the model.
These are government employees?
No, these are not government employees.
Okay.
Absolutely not. These are leading scientists, scholars, people who are in the employ of think tanks, research centers, universities. They are not government employees. These are independently developed, peer-reviewed models. And they are always working on the models, from my understanding. And periodically, they release new versions of the model. That does not mean that the government would reconvene the interagency working group every single time there's a new version. I think that, as the 2010 technical support document said, every 2 years or so, it is worth taking a good look and seeing if a revision to the number is warranted. Now, I will acknowledge that it is a number that can change. On the other hand, there's a choice that the government faces: to use the change number that reflects the most up-to-date science and economics, or simply to cover our eyes and say, well, we're going to stick with what we have because, well, it's what we've been using and we don't want to change things.
So here's a problem, though. The cost of living has gone up. But because we are in sequestration, because we have a debt and a deficit, we have not increased the salaries of Federal employees. They're frozen. In fact, they have been reduced because they're being furloughed.
Yes.
So I don't know if we can be totally purists in dealing with the science of an SCC, just like if you're being a purist, the salaries of Federal employees should have gone up over the last 3 or 4 years, and they have been static or declined. So we've got to create some certainty for the business community that's going to be subject to rules that come down the pike from various Federal agencies that will be utilizing the SCC in analysis, correct?
Can I add something? I could not agree more. Part of this is the certainty issue.
About that, huh?
About that part, yeah, the one. Kidding. That's a big part of this, is that it's done in 2010, and then it shows up in a microwave rule in 2013. It's gone up by 50%. There doesn't seem to be any outside communication on it, other than just in the future, we can take this on a rule at a time. And while you said this was not done in a black box, I don't know the names of the people that were involved in this. I don't know the minutes of it. I don't know the conversation that occurred. I'm not aware if they looked at other models. I don't know if there was a conversation to say, gosh, this model changed 50% in 3 years. Maybe we should get a different model. And so while you say it wasn't done in a black box because there are these studies that are over here and everyone should have known the studies were changing, and so of course we were going to change this as well, there wasn't comment from the outside and there wasn't interaction with the United States Congress, House or Senate side. And so suddenly while people are trying to prepare, think, and especially people that deal with energy, those folks have to think 10, 15 years ahead. You don't plan to do a major power plant or an export facility or any other refinery and think, okay, 3 years from now we're going to do X. That was 10 years ago when they started that process of planning that. And now to know that every 3 years this could change is a very, very difficult dynamic for them.
Well, I think that if there is evidence that the costs that are being caused by emissions are changing up or down over time, regulation going forward needs to take account of it.
Right. Okay. I don't mean to interrupt you on that. You said that kind of thing a couple times. My fear of that is that you've got these science-based models that are out here from a group of scientists that agree on this one principle. The principle really is there. If you disagree with this rule, then go make your own model. If you go get your own model and get a group of scientists together that they may disagree with this model, create your own model and come compete with the models that we have. So you're basically saying to industry, these are the models that we're going to use. These are the folks that we like. These are the folks that are doing a model on the social cost of carbon. And so to states, to counties, to any kind of business group, whatever it may be, if you want to be in this and play ball, go get a group of scientists, go create your own social cost of carbon model, and then come compete with our models.
So let me respond to that, because that would be worrisome, and it's certainly not the case. I don't know whether we like the people who are developing these models or not. What we like is the fact that these are models that are being developed by groups of people whose work is constantly peer-reviewed, that their results are constantly published, and very importantly, anybody can dig in and say, there is a problem with the science in this model. There is a problem with the assumptions. These are things that people have the opportunity to inform the government about.
Right, but I would assume in peer review, there were some people that pushed back on it as well. There were just, I'm going to make up numbers, okay, there's 10 people that peer reviewed it, 7 of them liked it, 3 of them didn't, and so it went and it moved. The impression is these 3 over here that don't like the model, go create your own model and come compete for this one, and then they can also get 10 people to peer review it and get 7 people that like it and try to come compete. You see what I mean? The reason I struggle with this is a very difficult number to get your hands on. Okay, so if the sea level rises a ½ inch 10 years from now, what effect does that have on Naples, Florida? If we have a 1/10 of a degree of climate change, what will that mean in wheat crops in Kansas? What will that mean to the sea? How much will the sea absorb the heat? How much will it take off the heat? I mean, all these are very, very difficult things where there are a lot of assumptions that are built into it. And yes, you can get any model that anyone can look at and get any group of peers to be able to say and publish in different documents to say, you know what, that's a model. I like part of it. I don't like part of it. Write arguments, write journal article, and it's out.
Well,
but this gets really difficult to settle when it's moving all the time and it's uncertain. And when the models update, then suddenly it changes our SEC as well.
Chairman Langford, to respond to your question, I think all I could say is that if we don't have faith in the scientific process of peer review, which is very different from a popularity vote of 3 like it and 7 like it, it involves replication, it involves a much more rigorous process than that. If we don't have that, then the whole concept of using the best available science, economics, and technical detail is one that would be very difficult to implement anywhere in any kind of regulation.
Could not agree more, except in this area, because climate science can't be replicated the same way that you do with other science. It is a lot of guesstimates and modeling and things that you look back on the past and you dig cores and you examine how much carbon was in the ice, and I get the process on it, but it's modeling future based on our best guess. So it's not a science that you can go and just replicate and say, okay, we did this, and so we can go look at it and 5 other people can look at it the same way. They're all just looking at a mathematical formulation and saying, I agree with your math, but do we agree with the assumption?
Except we do that all the time. I mean, pension plans anticipate that we're going to have 7% returns, and therefore that's what, on that basis, that's what's going to be taken out of your check, and that's what the employer is going to contribute. So we do that.
No, I couldn't agree more, but that's what I'm saying. It's not a science at that point. It's a best guess. because it's a forward-looking. Now, I'm not trying to denigrate the scientists that are in the middle of it. That's not what I'm trying to do. But a lot of what this does is look back in history and then try to look forward on it. It's why it makes it very difficult to be able to process this, which is why I think it needs as much sunshine in the process as possible, which is why we're here today, because it appeared, and none of us had input, and we don't really know the process, the names of the people, the process, the whys, the how, the minutes. It just showed up.
So what kind of commentary have you received from people since it was attached to the microwave rule?
I'd have to go back and look and see what the range of comments were that came in on that particular microwave rule. I can tell you that since social cost of carbon came into being and was attached to the small electric motor rule in 2010, there has been significant comment on social cost of carbon. And one of the reasons for the 2013 update was commentary saying you're using a number that is too low, that is out of date. And I will tell you that a lot of the criticism of the social cost of carbon number is that it is too low, that it is underestimating the effects, that our discount rates are too high, that we are over, and we have the interagency working group, the administration, is trying to take to not have a number seems like a very bad course of action.
Yeah, that's not the debate today. It's
Right.
to not have a number. The debate is the number went up 50% in 3 years. The model was that far off. We're trying to figure out why and how.
Well, and I think the other part of this discussion is, should there be a more kind of open process by which there's a healthy debate or discussion about the social cost of
So to be clear, though, about the number going up from 2010 to 2013, that had nothing to do with anything that anybody in the government did.
I know it's our model.
It's the models. The inputs that the government chose haven't changed. And
Can you tell me 3 years from now the model doesn't go up another 50%?
I can't tell you what the model is going to do.
I know, that's what I'm
in the
saying.
next 3 years.
So there's no predictability.
But predictability is certainly not the only value. If the model is based on good science and economics, or the best available science and economics, and does show another 50% increase, we think it would be irresponsible not to factor that cost to society of carbon emissions into future rulemaking.
Well, here's the dilemma, though. If you look at the minimum wage right now in this country, it's painfully inadequate. But we have not done anything significant to increase it in many years. And the result is that you've got to really have 2 or 3 jobs if you want to just survive on the minimum wage. You're saying that we have a responsibility to factor in the social cost of carbon, and I agree with you. But if it were to jump another 50% in 3 years, I think you've got to allow policymakers to evaluate whether or not at this particular point in time we can afford to have the SCC go up.
So let me address that. The SCC going up doesn't cost anybody a penny.
It's every rule that it's applied to.
It is an input into rules, and those rules will get evaluated on their costs and benefits. And it is an absolute priority of the Obama administration to make sure that regulation reflects a common sense balance between the needs to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the American people and the American people yet to come, and prosperity, jobs, economic growth for the current generation. Those things are absolutely at the core of regulatory decision-making in the Obama administration.
Can you tell me what the next administration will do with that?
I cannot tell you what the next administration will do with that.
Neither can we. That's the problem.
but-
We're setting a path that this changes 50%
Well, maybe
with an
not, though.
uncertain,
But what I can tell you is that
Next
the
administration may just not
they'll have the same
deal with it.
or they
executive
could take it
orders.
straight back, or they could say, no, we'll go back 50%.
Well, they'll have the same executive orders, and I would hope the same obligation to do rigorous cost-benefit analysis. The concern that we really have to take into account, and why this is different from the minimum wage, is if the social cost of carbon is some certain number out there, and maybe it's much higher than what we've calculated to date or what the models have calculated, maybe it will turn out to go down as more information comes up. One thing is clear, though. Suppose there is a 50% jump in 3 years, and that the best available science and economics says, yep, We weren't quite there the last time. We've got more information. It's higher than we thought. To turn our backs on that is to say those costs, and let's remember what the social cost of carbon is. It is a measure of the cost to society of emitting a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere.
Long term.
Long term. What we're willing to say is, yeah, we've got some current costs, and believe me, those current costs need to be taken very, very seriously. I do not for a minute question their effect or take lightly their effect on current consumers, on current business, on anything. We would be saying we don't care what the costs are for our grandchildren. That would be the statement that, yeah, they went up 50%. The best available science in economics, which, by the way, is good science in economics, says that it's gone up 50%. But boy, that's just another big change, and that seems problematic. So we're going to impose those costs on future generations and not worry about reducing those carbon emissions. That would be contrary to the best information available to do a current cost-benefit analysis.
I have a little bit of an issue with that just for us and our economy. And let me just voice this, and you can see if you want to jump in on this or not. But the United States, our carbon emissions have gone down in the last 5 years, the last 7 years, I think it is even. Our carbon emissions have gone down. We're switching over using more natural gas. A lot of things have occurred, and our CO2 levels are now down to our 2007 time. I think it's maybe even 2006 time. So we've watched that occur while it's still rising in other parts of the world. And what happens is we continue to layer on and say, okay, this is occurring, this model is occurring, though we're bringing down our carbon emissions in the United States, it's still going up in other areas of the world, and so we anticipate this is going to happen, and so we hit the American economy one more time with a penalty, and it's not happening in other areas. So China continues to elevate that, continues to win economically, continues to put out more and more carbon. If that's the model that's here, we continue to denigrate more and more. This is not a good cycle for us. And it's driven based on a rule that, again, I'd love for us to agree to know who is in this interagency working group and anything about their meetings, to be able to get their notes, the people, the votes, anything about it, because this black box that you say doesn't exist seems to be a kind of a black box to us.
Well, just to repeat, the social cost of carbon, again, is not a rule, but
I know, but it's applied to every rule. I get that.
It's not applied to every rule, though.
But it's applied to key rules that will be very impactful on energy and production of food and transportation.
And just to say a word about the global impacts, what we're measuring are the global costs of American carbon emissions. And I don't know, as I sit here today, whether as we produce less, others are producing more because we're producing less. If we produced more, it would be more carbon emissions, and we're taking account of those costs. It is a global problem, and it seems much easier to exercise global leadership and to get other countries around the world to recognize the social cost of carbon if we are doing so ourselves.
I sat down with a quick pen to try to determine, based on this rule, this new rule of $33, if I take the middle range on that, what China puts out and how that affects our economy. It's about $268 billion is what I would estimate based on China's production of carbon from the most recent numbers that I could find, and add to it this $33 a ton. So with that, if we were to layer that principle on it, we would say, okay, China, we need to hit them for $268 billion worth of tariffs at some point to make up what they've done to our economy, because they seem to be punishing our economy as they're producing it because it's a global problem. If we get into that and begin to apply this rule in those areas, now suddenly it's like, okay, India, here we are, we're going to have to apply more tariffs to you because you've got this, and it's suddenly this sudden rise. I just have some concerns on how it's going to be used. Obviously, you don't set that, but those are issues that we'll have to take on in the days ahead. But the number is extremely important to us because it doesn't seem to differentiate where it occurs. So if you have carbon produced in western Oklahoma where you have relatively few people, or in Los Angeles, there's no difference in that. Is that correct?
That is correct, because carbon emissions travel. You CO2.
Right, and so we're in the same issue with that. And I don't know if that's where the administration's headed towards this, or what the plan is to say, China, you produce too much carbon, you produce X amount, we're going to do $268 billion worth of tariffs on you to make sure that we balance out what you've done to our economy. Or worldwide, it was right at $1 trillion of total cost to our economy based on the carbon that's in the atmosphere right now produced worldwide. So do we find some way to be able to hit every country in the world to make sure that we get $1 trillion worth back into our economy for the damage that they've done? Does that make sense? Again, that's not something that you're going to have to resolve today, but those are issues we've got to look at long term. Those are policy issues, but this is a policy thing that has been set in this black box that we want to be able to allow some conversation into.
I don't know that I would call it a black box, but just for the record.
Okay.
I mean,
We don't know who, we don't know when, we don't know how often they meet, we don't know where they meet, we don't have notes of it.
but we do know what. And
We do know the result as it came out in the microwave rule.
And it's
It's sort of like
it's a testable
Wikipedia,
result.
you know?
Yeah, it's a
People can
test-
go in and change things that reflect reality, and more people look at it. And
But the interagency working group, we know the agencies, but we don't know, do we know who attended the meetings from the agencies?
Well, I have no personal knowledge of that.
See, that's one of, again, we're back to, we know the agencies, but we don't know who, we don't know how the decisions were made, we don't know how they addressed the science, we don't know if they looked at other models, we don't know. And we weren't a part of any of the conversation, but it's going to affect our economy significantly.
But the numbers that they used as inputs they selected and the models they used are ones that are fully available to be challenged,
Right,
critiqued,
no, yeah, we
have
talked
all
about
been
that.
peer reviewed.
and
right.
tested.
We get that, so we're back to the same thing. If you don't like it, get your own model and bring it, and then be a part of the process
Or
to try to get into
pull
it.
apart the models that were used because they're on the Internet and explain what's wrong with them.
Well, do you know if they looked at other models?
As I said, the interagency working group, my understanding is that they considered all models that could achieve what the interagency working group wanted to achieve, which was the social cost of carbon. There are lots of models that do much more limited things that would not have been relevant. By some measures, these models are the ones that are used in virtually all, I mean, some extreme, well into the 90% of research that is done on social cost of carbon.
You have additional questions?
I don't, but I want to just thank you for taking these rapid-fire questions and handling them so well, and for your participation. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to leave.
I know we want to honor your time as well. This is what all your hearings will be like from here on out. They'll all be just like this.
That would be fine.
So that'd be great. I appreciate you coming. We'll have some additional follow-ups. We'll try to follow up formally with a letter that I'll make sure the ranking member is also aware of as we send it out, with just a list of some of the things we talked about today that you obviously don't have in 8 days' experience to be there, of some of the people, the process, interagency working group, the functionality, how the decision's made. And then we may even follow up with where the social cost of carbon rule even came up at all. As we discussed before, we're not aware of where it originated on it, so we can actually find out and get the history of it and bring it up. Thank you very much for that. This meeting is adjourned.
mashed garlic cloves and peppercorns. Sort of a classic nage for good tarantula cookery. So believe it or not, she's actually seasoning that with instant chicken soup mix. This stuff is good for this, huh? It's good? Yeah, chicken.
So that's her secret. This is going to be awesome.
Boy, I'll tell you, the garlic and the black pepper and the salt and sugar starting to break down, and the salt and sugar is actually starting to liquidize on there.
When frying the furry fellas, it's advised to stand a short distance from the sizzling wok. Exploding tarantulas can be hazardous.
Oh, yeah. Whoa! It's whistling. They're whistling in the oil.
It takes about 3 minutes to fry all the fur off the tarantulas. Everyone in this household is holding their breath in anticipation.
I'm very excited. Very excited. I can't wait any longer.